So, first of all, I would like to start the session, and we welcome all of you here with us. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depend what where you are. And that is great that we have webinars again for this year, and that it could be the first one for this year. And this webinar series, we talk about rethinking capitalism and economic order, that we invite speaker author that who are expert in this field to present, to share their knowledge on the topic. The idea is that we want to rethinking about capitalism in the world and how we can do with capitalism, what shape capitalism through history and through politics and other linkage that linked capitalism to the development. And last year, last month, we had a webinar series with Professor Robinson from Canada, who talk about rethinking intellectual property and data, that he's focused on the economic and social land. And today we have special keynote speaker that joined us today, Professor David McNally. He's very grateful that accept our invitation and join us as the speaker, and very appreciate for him to spend his time with us, and also appreciate for everyone that you are spend time with us for this session. And before we start the session, I would like to read a little bit about the background and the bio of Professor David. So Professor David McNally, he is the distinguished professor of history and business at the University of Houston, uh, and director of the Center for the Study of Capitalism. Professor David came to University of Houston after teaching political economy at York University, Toronto in Canada for over 30 years. At very young age, when he was a high school student, Professor also involved in social movement against to Vietnam War, and he's also in entering to university. He also organized like a campaign or campus capture at the community of Free Islander. Davis early step out lifetime of activists in global justice, anti uh, radicalism, and socialist movement. Along the way, he earned his PhD in social and political thought in 1983. Professor David, he has been published many books, including the last one that he will discuss with us about slavery and capitalism. But his first book is about political economy and the rise of capitalism, that published in 1988. Another book about against the market, the book on the body of meaning, the study of language, labels, and revelation. And he also published a book about another world. It's possible, globalization, anti-capitalism, and the book on global slum, the economy and politics of crisis and resistance. The book on monster and market, zombie, primarily global capitalism, and another book about plot and money. So you can find his publication online. Just search his name on Google, and I think you can see a lot of publication that are available, maybe free access online, or maybe you need to buy the book to read as the copy. Maybe it's very great. And for today's session, Professor will discuss about his new book, and I just debriefed about the book that said that Karl Marx writing the enslavement, and labor has fell out the favorite among historians, but Professor David reject the new line into them. Slavery and capitalism give them the first systematic Marxist account to the capitalist characteristic Atlantic slavery. using colonized travel literature, plan the record and diary, and slaves narrative to support the provocative claim for insult labor in the plantation system or as the capitalist comedy production. And together with history, political economics, and radical uh, abolitionist, Professor David demonstrated that the plantation slave form in the modern working class, unlike those scholars who insist that enslaved people were to incentive to set their sign on liberty. He highlighted the cell activity and out in slow people fighting for their freedoms and reframes their insistence as labor strugglings over production and reproduction, with a significant implication for the United States Atlantic's history and for understanding the root cause of radical capitalism. So, Professor David, the floor is yours, and you will have around 40 minutes or 35 minutes to discuss. And after that, we will jump to the Q&A session. And we are very appreciate to have you here. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you for that kind introduction. Very generous of you. And let me thank everybody who has joined our session today. I look forward to the conversation with you. And really, what I'd like to do is tell you a little bit about the intellectual context to which this book is responding, and then outline for you some of the key arguments that I develop in Slavery and Capitalism. And so, Sattwick, if we can go to the first or the next slide, that would be great. Because, of course, every time we write, we have a context of debates and discussions in our minds. And there are really two that interlocked in my own thinking in working on this book. The first is what in the United States has been called the new history of capitalism. Now, this development among historians was a response to the global economic crisis of 2008, 2009. As you will know, in early 2008, the five largest investment banks on Wall Street all collapsed. The US stock market lost 50% of its value. Historians, they were shocked that their profession had overwhelmingly neglected political economy. History as a profession had seen the so-called cultural turn, the turn to issues of language and culture, a very strong emphasis on discourse as the center of historical study. Then something as profound as a global economic crisis came, and they realized that as a whole, even though this was a profound historical event, they did not have the capacities to analyze it, to offer a historical interpretation. And so there was what's called a turn to political economy among historians in the United States, and the generation of a new body of literature known as the New History of Capitalism. Most recently, the Harvard University historian Sven Beckert has published his book, Capitalism, a 1,000-page study. Uh, and that's really an outgrowth of everything that's been going on since 2008 or so. That is to say, it's the culmination of 15 or 17, 8 or 18 years of ongoing debates and discussions among historians. But I felt in relationship to those debates that historians in the United States, because of the profound weight of liberalism within this society, had not truly engaged with alternative understandings of capitalism, radical and Marxian understandings of capitalism. They tended to use capitalism in a very loose-handed way to mean something maybe like market society. But they did not have an overall deep theory of what capitalism is, and most of them would admit that. One major study, for example, says, I'm not really interested in what capitalism is. I'll just use the term as a placeholder. So I was responding in part to this, insisting on the need for a deep theory of capitalism as a system of global social relations of production. But in addition, in order to intervene in these discussions, I also needed, as point number two shows you on the screen, to address older Marxist debates. Because in the United States, the preeminent understanding of a Marxist interpretation of slavery in the history of capitalism had come from the US historian Eugene Genovese. And Genovese, throughout the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s, produced a whole series of volumes in which he argued that plantation slavery in the United States was pre-capitalist, essentially feudal, that the planter class was essentially an aristocratic class. And I thought this to be seriously faulty as an analysis. And so I needed in this book, if I was going to make the case for a deeper theory of capitalism, also to challenge that understanding that Genovese, a huge influence in historical circles in the United States, that Genovese had put forward, identifying Marxists and Marxist political economy with the idea of plantation slavery as non-capitalist. And so I was addressing really those two sets of debates. And keep in mind, of course, that the importance of slavery within US capitalism was being underscored at the same time by the Black Lives Matter movement. It was clear that, contrary to what President Obama had said when he was first elected in the United States, it was clear that the United States was not a so-called post-racial society. That had been Obama's pledge, that we are now in a post-racial period. But in fact, the increase in police killings of Black people on the streets of the United States and other markers of intensified racial oppression made it clear that racial capitalism was far from over in the United States. So that's the context for the discussion. At that point, I needed to develop along two lines. First, to do a detailed investigation of the archive of the plantation system. And this consists in particular of the journals of plantation owners, slave owners, their journals, their record books, and their accounts. Because one of the things we've learned is that accounting was more developed, say, in 1800 in the plantation system than it was in the small factories in the United States. They kept amazingly detailed business records of output per head, tobacco, cotton, sugar, and so on, of profit margins, costs, inputs to production, and so on and so forth. They produced very detailed accounting. And so we're able now, by looking at all this data, to develop a pretty impressive overview of the profitability of the plantation system. And it's clear that, first, plantations were an enormously profitable investment in the Atlantic world. Moreover, profitability tended to increase with the scale of production. Large plantations of over 200 enslaved workers, for instance, tended to be consistently more productive than smaller plantations of fewer than 50 enslaved workers, and so on. So, working with this kind of data, studying plantation records, and so on, I also needed to bring it into dialogue with Marxian political economy. But I needed to do it in a way that developed new concepts. So, the three new concepts that I developed, and I'll put those out for you now, and then I'll take you through the details of the argument, were these. My, my three, I think, most important contributions to the discussion. First,
Não, tem certeza?
first, I put across the concept of the coerced subsumption of labor to capital. Many of you will know that in Marx's analysis, he argues that there are two different kinds of ways in which labor can be subsumed by capital, either formally or directly, or what he calls real subsumption. That is to say, in formal subsumption, the capitalist controls an overall process of production and marketing. In real subsumption, they directly employ laborers. But I argued that the second form, direct subsumption, also had a coerced version where labor power is not bought continually through the market, but is in fact bought in a one-time only purchase of the bonded laborer themselves. That took me to the second concept of bonded labor power. And I'll come back to this one with you. And from these, I also moved, particularly, we'll get to this on my last slide with you, to the concept of the chattel proletariat. People who were legally chattel property, but who were also working class producers of surplus value. Okay, so let me take you through some of the details. And Sattwick, if we could go to the next slide, please. This is where I take up the issue of the subsumption of labor. And I'm quoting here from an important document called Letters on Slavery by a man named William Dixon, published the same year as the outbreak of the French Revolution, 1789. And William Dixon had spent some months in the sugar colony of Barbados. Barbados was the earliest sugar plantation in the British Empire, and it innovated many of the methods of sugar production by bonded laborers. And this is a description that Dixon provides in his letters of field labor in the sugarcane fields. And I'll read it through with you. The holes are dug with hoes by the slaves in a row, with the driver at one end to preserve the line. Remember, the driver is the slave driver with a whip. They begin and finish a row of these holes as nearly as at the same instant as possible, so that this equal task must be performed in the same time by a number of people who, it is next to impossible, should all be equally strong and dexterous. Now, many of you will recognize here Marx's description of abstract human labor. of labor that is quantified and standardized in such a way that the concrete differences between people are overcome as they are pushed into a uniform set of physical movements and operations that, irrespective of their differences in size, strength, dexterity, and so on, they must all perform according to the same time discipline and the same time measurements. And so we get here already a description of the way in which the direct labor process, the immediate process of production, is being planned, organized according to certain divisions of labor, supervised and disciplined according to capitalist time disciplines. This is something that we find in all generalized commodity production, and we see it here in Dixon's description directly of what is going on in the plantation. And so the profitability of plantation slavery that I described for you earlier. And it's a profitability when we look at the best data we have, we find that on average, plantations producing commodities such as coffee, cotton, sugar, tobacco, and others goods were generally returning 8 to 15% returns on investment every year. Obviously, these are averages, and we have some cases that are higher and obviously cases that are less efficient. But overall, this was an enormously profitable set of business operations involving millions of bonded workers throughout the Americas. Okay, Sattwick, if we could go to the next slide, please. The other dimension that I try to bring into this discussion is that we need to look at slavery and capitalism not only from above, but also from below. This is, of course, the commitment that history from below as an orientation within the discipline of history makes. I do try to show how, from the standpoint of the planter class, this was an enormously profitable undertaking. And remember, they were producing commodities that were moving through global circuits. Most of these commodities were being sold in Europe, and they were getting global finance. Much of their finance was coming from Europe, for instance. So you have globally integrated production systems that are also integrated into circuits of global finance. That's the view from above. But in 1938, as some of you will know, the Trinidadian Marxist C.L.R. James wrote his famous book, The Black Jacobins, the first really systematic social history of the revolution in Haiti, in which a slave army, which ultimately numbered in tens of thousands, defeated three empires, the French, the Spanish, and the British, and after a war of 13 years, established an independent Black republic that had abolished slavery. That revolution breaks out in 1791, 2 years after the start of the revolution in France, and Haiti declares its independence on January 1st of 1804. So it's a nearly 13-year war against colonialism and slavery. And C.L.R. James, in describing the plantation system, and by 1789, the plantation system in what was then known as Saint-Domingue, the French name, or San Domingo, the Spanish name, what becomes Haiti in 1804, the plantation system was the largest in the world, the most productive in the world. There were about 500,000 enslaved workers in Haiti, or Saint-Domingue, as it was at the time, producing overwhelmingly sugar, but also coffee. And in his study, CLR James writes, working and living together in gangs of hundreds on the huge sugar factories which covered the northern plain. That's the northern plain of what is now Haiti. Later historians have added deep studies of the southern plantations within Haiti, but CLR James had the best access in 1938 to studies of the northern plain. They were closer to a modern proletariat than any group of workers in existence at the time, and the rising was, therefore, a thoroughly prepared and organized mass movement. So I want to underline several points for you here. First, working and living together in gangs of hundreds. Large plantations in the 1780s, before the outbreak of the revolution, were among the largest industrial work sites in the world. Much, much larger, for example, than the just emerging textile mills in the northeast of the United States. Much larger at the time. The scale of investment was many, many times what was necessary to start a cotton mill in Britain. And I provide data on this in the book. He describes them as huge sugar factories, and other historians have used the term factories in the fields. These were not simply directly agricultural operations, although they were significantly agricultural. There were curing houses, boiling houses. There were distilling operations. There were refineries. And we see by this time, in the most developed regions, an enormous move from about the 1780s or so onwards towards power mills, power-driven mills. The steam engine becomes critical to the production. So we've got integrated agro-industrial complexes. There's tilling of the land, there's harvesting, but there's also curing, boiling, distilling, and refining that is happening in dedicated sections with detailed divisions of labor and with the same kinds of time discipline that we're talking about. So when CLR James says they were closer to a modern proletariat than any group of workers in existence at the time, this is not just a rhetorical flourish. He means us to take this quite seriously, to ask ourselves in 1791, when the revolution broke out, where in the world do we find larger, more capital intensive, more disciplined agro-industrial production processes, or simply industrial production processes, which were regularly being mechanized, whose tools were being regularly developed, improved, and so on. And then he concludes, and this is where I go in the last third of the book. Because of this, the rising, their uprising, was therefore a thoroughly prepared and organized mass movement. And this is something that I'll come back to and spend a little bit more time on before I draw my remarks to a conclusion with you. But CLR James is also saying that this experience of large-scale collectivized production also gave enslaved resistance certain distinctive features. Their resistance was collective in nature, it was prepared, it was organized in ways that constituted actual mass movements. Before I turn to that, however, let me deal with one other point. And Sattwick, if we could do the next slide, please. Because I also try to remind readers that the position that I'm putting forward is highly compatible with a number of lines of argument that we find in Marx's work. Marx says in Capital Volume 1 that before the 18th century was over in the United States, and I'll mention why Marx knows the United States best in a moment, but before the 18th century was over in the United States, plantation slavery had lost what he calls its largely patriarchal character and had become a capitalist enterprise. And in volume 3 of Capital, there is an interesting aside. Marx is laying out his account of capitalist ground rent, rent of land. But then, as he often does in his manuscripts, he gets interested in a related problem. Not only the price of land, but of course, when he thinks about the price of land in the US South or the Caribbean, he needs to think about land that is being worked by enslaved laborers, and they are being purchased as chattel property. And so he writes, the price that is paid here for the slave is no more than the anticipated and capitalized surplus value or profit that is to be extracted from him. In other words, just like the price that is paid for land is a capitalized value derived from rent. You take a 5% rate of return, you capitalize it at 20 years to get to 100, and you arrive at the price of land. Marx is arguing that the same process, capitalizing average surplus value, allows us to arrive at the price for enslaved people. And the interesting thing is that once the plantation system with the integrated plantation, as it's known, that agro-industrial complex that I was describing earlier, is created, we then do in fact find that over time, the prices of enslaved people rise in tandem with their output and their profitability to capital. They track enormously closely together, and I provide some data on this in the book. But notice as well that Marx uses the term surplus value here. He doesn't say they just produce a surplus product, which all exploited workforces do. They're producing a surplus value because, just as he outlines in volume 1 of Capital, the commodities that are produced are not use values for immediate consumption by the planter class. This is not a classically feudal arrangement where lords are consuming the bulk of what their peasants produce for them as use values. On the contrary, these commodities, which are produced in millions of pounds, bushels, and so on, are, as I said earlier, commodities for sale in global markets. Therefore, they have to be monetized. And profit and surplus value thus takes a classically monetary form in the plantation system, as it does in any sort of classic Marxian definition of capitalism. So I'm not trying to say in the book, which would be an uninteresting exercise, Marx agreed with me or I agree with Marx. I'm trying to show Marx never did a sustained study of Atlantic slavery. I said to you he knew most about the United States, and the reason for that, and this is something that I discuss in the final chapter of the book, is that Marx was borderline obsessed with the Civil War in the United States. The bulk of his journalistic writings and almost every important debate in the International Working Men's Association of the time referenced the United States. One of the chapters in the history of the international left, which has really disappeared for us, is that there was a vibrant Marxist movement in the United States around the First International, and they were deeply embedded in the abolitionist movement. To be someone associated with the First International in the United States was to be an abolitionist, and it was to be part of the abolitionist movement against slavery. And Marx's writings on the Civil War in the United States forced him to think about the system of slave production in the South that he hoped would be overthrown as a result of the Civil War. And several of Marx's close friends going back to 1848 became high-ranking officers in the Union Army in the United States. One of them, in fact, August Willich, became a general in the Union Army, and he was writing regularly to Marx all throughout the Civil War, as were other of Marx's German American friends. So this is why he takes such a deep interest, and it seems to me that it's important to show that there is a foundation in Marxist political economy for this line of argument. That is to say, the idea that enslaved workers were producers of surplus value. But this doesn't mean that I'm simply waving the wand of orthodoxy and saying Marx is right about everything, and therefore, since I'm echoing Marx, I'm right. I'm simply at times showing the points of convergence that are interesting in this study and that help my theoretical framing of the argument. All right, Sattwick, we could go to the next slide, please, and then this is the one on which I'll conclude. I try to show in the book that not only did enslaved people operate within a system of capitalist slavery as commodity producers who were generating surplus value, but that they also organized and resisted in demonstrably modern working class ways. And so I try to spend some time showing that in addition to small scale strikes, which happened all the time, and the small scale strikes could be anything from a few workers leaving the plantation to a general plantation uprising. And those were usually quite violent clashes, but also occasionally to outright mass strikes. And so I try to trace a pattern from 1795 to the end of the Civil War in the United States. So over a period of 70 years, from 1795 to 1865. And so I start with a strike of 1,000 enslaved workers in Curacao, next to Venezuela, which grew into a month-long multiracial rebellion. Then I moved to the early mass strikes during the Haitian Revolution, when France under Bonaparte, having earlier abolished colonial slavery, which the National Convention did in 1794 in France, Bonaparte restores slavery and invades Saint-Domingue and does battle with Toussaint Louverture's army. Bonaparte sends his nephew. He doesn't go himself, but he sends 60,000 troops. And Toussaint Louverture, the leader of the army of enslaved people, calls for strikes on the plantations. Carolyn Fick, in her book on the Haitian Revolution, shows us that, in fact, the Haitian Revolution was prepared by a decade of plantation strikes, that the militancy and combativity of enslaved people in Haiti had developed over a decade of strikes. But in 1798, there were orchestrated mass strikes against the French invasion. I then moved to a famous revolt in Barbados in 1816. And here we get, and we'll see this repeatedly, we get a deliberate call by leaders of these movements for strike action. There's a growing recognition by the early 1800s that the mass withdrawal of labor is the most effective way to defeat the planter class. And so Buss's revolt involves a wave of plantation strikes in Barbados in April of 1816. Something similar in 1823 in what was then the British colony of Demerara. It had been a Dutch colony, and the British had seized it. And this time, the leaders had directly advocated for workers to, quote, lay down their tools and leave the plantations. One of the most famous is the Christmas time strike in Jamaica of 1831, which continues into January of 1832, where we know at least 30,000 enslaved Jamaican workers refused to work. And this was the uprising that finally forced the British Empire into abolition. Now, there were all kinds of other strategic considerations, but this was why they determined that it was not worth the cost of policing the system. And again, Reverend Sharp said that we must sit down. They did a commission of investigation afterwards. That was the term used by one of the enslaved people who'd been involved. But of course, the same idea was repeated by any number. So the idea of laying down tools, sitting down, stopping work was becoming a mass phenomenon. And then finally, I used the case of the 1861 to 1865 general strike of the slaves as the great historian and sociologist W.E.B. Du Bois put it in his book, Black Reconstruction in America, where something in the neighborhood of 400 to 500,000 enslaved people left the U.S. South, fled to Union lines, withdrew their labor from the South, essentially economically crippling the Confederacy, and 200,000 of them joined the Union Army and Navy. So they actually redeployed their labor power in defeating the Confederacy in the Civil War in the United States. This is what Du Bois calls the general strike of the slaves. Let me just add a couple of points in conclusion on this. For me, the argument about a chattel proletariat rests considerably on this evidence that not only were they exploited in working class ways as producers of surplus value, but most significantly from a history from below standpoint, they organized and resisted in demonstrably working class ways, including strikes and mass strikes. But I spend one chapter of the book also showing how these movements were related to struggles over social reproduction. And I want to emphasize that it's not just struggles at the site of production, but also struggles to win time away from production for what social reproduction theorists, Marxist feminists, have called life making, time devoted to reproducing households, caring for children, cooking, worshiping, recreation, planting gardens, and so on. And much of the battle in the plantation system was over time, what Marx calls the political economy of time. How much is devoted to producing for capital, and how much time can be devoted to reproducing social life, family structures and relations, communities, and so on. The last point I'll make is that I think if the book has a wider application beyond this case study, It's to the broader reconsideration of forms of bonded labor generally within the history of capitalism. Because, of course, it's not only enslaved labor which is at issue, it's all forms of indentured labor that I would say an overly formalistic liberalism and Marxism sometimes makes the mistake of equating capitalism or market society with, quote, free labor, unquote. And yet the reality is that we see throughout the history of capitalism widespread use of bonded labor, labor which is not juridically free. And this is something that I believe needs to be fully and properly integrated into our understanding of the history of capitalism. And I'll finish on this last point. We know that neoliberalism is supposed to be about the freeing up of markets from external intervention. And yet, all of the scholars of the new slavery, who argue that there are about 100 million enslaved people on the planet today, they show us that the so-called new slavery has increased with the ostensible freeing of markets under neoliberalism. In other words, if the freeing of markets, quote unquote, is really about the augmentation of the power of big business and capital, then we shouldn't be surprised that where bonded labor is highly productive for their purposes, that we might see an increase in a proliferation of bonded labor. And so I think all of this points to the ongoing reconsideration of the historical significance of bonded labor within the history of global capitalism. Okay, I've gone on long enough. Thank you so much for indulging me. I look forward to the discussion with you.
Thank you, David. Thank you very, very much for your time and your wisdom. And we are looking forward to listen to the question or comments that you may have. The floor is open to all of you. Please raise your hand. I would request that first you state your name and probably where you're from, and then you can ask the question. Be very precise. We want to hear from David and not from us. So questions, please. I can start the first one, but that's not the point. Okay, let me ask the first question so that others have time to think and ask you the question. So often, so again, thank you, David. I'm Sattwick. I'm based in a small town in India. So the question is, it's often that it's difficult for anyone who believes in a market-based economy, if I'm being very neutral about what is happening around us, to acknowledge that the system is based on exploitation, be it in a bonded labor or feudal tendency like rent seeking within the current system. But we see from your work and many others that from the beginning itself, the signs were there. So if efficiency is and maximization of profit are the main goal of today's system, why they're hesitating to accept that, okay, we are like this, we like to extract and exploit and yeah, what's wrong in it? I mean, why they are so hesitating and why they want to come and appear like they're saints and then everything is very nice and better than what it used to be before?
Well, my own view on this, Sattwick, and it's a great question, is that there is a dilemma for classical liberalism, given the association of so-called free markets with individual freedom. And in classical liberalism, there's ultimately a claim that the two work hand in hand, that as you free the market, you enhance or maximize opportunities for individual free development. And as you know, that doesn't sit terribly well with the other economic maxim, which all students learn in an introductory economics course, which is that the business enterprise works by way of cost minimization and profit maximization. Because, of course, cost minimization centrally includes the cost of labor. And it means that the enterprise has an inherent incentive in reducing the living standards and the human flourishing of those it employs. And of course, it also raises the question that is right at the heart of what you've said, which is that bonded labor can be enormously profitable. And therefore, the economic flourishing of the enterprise is contrary to the human flourishing of its employees. That's a very difficult dilemma for classical liberalism. John Locke tries to navigate it by making the right to property so foundational. But then, of course, it always raises the question, and this emerged as early as the great debates during the English Revolution of the 1640s. What about the rights of those without property? Do they have any rights to life against the right of property owners? And as I say, I think that's a fundamental dilemma for liberalism, and classically liberalism does not address it and simply tries to get around it by insisting on the identity of free markets with individual freedom. And because, as you say, as soon as we understand the business enterprise as profit seeking and profit making inherently, I think that's a deep dilemma. And I really don't think they've managed to find a serious theoretical response to that. The result is to generally say that all these forms of bondage aren't capitalist, which is a sneaky move, and I don't think it holds up historically.
Thank you, David. Thank you for your answer. So I was trying to follow who raised the hand first. I think Anna, and then Jos, and then Gaia. Anna, please.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, thank you so much, David. I'm looking forward to read your book. I didn't have the chance to read it yet, but well, I have a two-part question. And the first one is that strikes me the resemblance with your book is Slavery and Capitalism, and Eric Williams is Capitalism and Slavery. Since you didn't mention him in the reconstruction, I wonder how you if you dialogue with his work and how your book, because I think it has been a movement in the historiography to bring back Eric Williams and his thesis, especially relating to the primitive accumulation and industrial revolution and slave trade. But he as Genovese believed that the plantation system is unprofitable because of the characteristics of slave labor. So I want to give you the chance to comment on that if you want to. And the second thing is that I've been waiting for your book to come for a long time, because there's no Marxist approach to a point that the new historians of new economic historians like Fogel and Time on the Cross looking for from a liberal and conservative perspective, that they have been telling us that the plantation slavery was profitable and was capitalist, but and using this to go to different conclusions. So I wonder if you also dialogue with them in this conclusion and show how your work is different. But I'm sorry, I did your book. I ordered your book. It didn't come still because I'm in Brazil, but it will come at some point. And thank you for your talk.
Thank you, Anna. Yes, those are really important points. So let me just tell you, I deliberately did not repeat Eric Williams' title, Capitalism is Slavery, which is why I turned the terms around. And it wasn't just because it would be pretentious on my part to do that. I have a very ambivalent connection to Eric Williams' book. Uh, on the one hand, I think you're absolutely right. His insistence that the profits of the plantation system played a significant role in England's, Britain's industrial development is very important. And I think you're right that contemporary scholarship is reaffirming that line of argument. Interestingly, of course, it doesn't sit terribly easily with his claim that the British Empire got rid of the system because it wasn't profitable anymore. And I think he's wrong on that. And I think he doesn't understand that this was politically driven by slave rebellion, by the rebellions of enslaved people. Uh, and it's interesting because I spent so much time working on and with CLR James. CLR James proposed to Eric Williams that this should be his thesis topic and helped him with the research of it because Williams did this book after James did the Black Jacobins. When Williams drafted Capitalism and Slavery, he sent the manuscript to James, and James said, "Where are the enslaved people?" And Williams slapped in a very short little chapter late in the book for that reason. And so, what is, I think, the enormous strength of CLR James, the understanding of the Haitian Revolution from below, is so absent in Williams' work that, as I say, I have an ambivalent relationship to it. It's very important in having challenged the mainstream liberal narrative and in insisting that the profits of the plantation system were indispensable to Britain's Industrial Revolution. But I think it has significant weaknesses that I hope my book helps to overcome. Fogel and Engerman, and those kinds of economic historians, I'll be a bit briefer on. What their work did was to, as you say, undermine the idea that the system was not profitable. As really empiricist economic historians, they do show us that the system was profitable, but they too essentially just treat enslaved people as factors of production, as inputs into the productive process. The subjectivity, consciousness, culture, organization, and resistance of enslaved people is really outside their framework. And so I think we can judiciously glean from their work, but it is in a very different sort of empiricist tradition in which history from below is non-existent. But thank you for that. I hope you enjoy the book.
Thank you, Anna, for the question. Thank you, Debbie. Now we will go to Joss and then Gaia. Joss, please. You have to unmute yourself. Joss, can you unmute yourself? Okay, so what we can do, just raise your voice once you can unmute yourself, and we will get back to you. So meanwhile, we can go to Gaia. Gaia, please go ahead.
Hi, thanks so much, David. That was a really fascinating presentation. Gaia from John Jay College. I'm doing a grad MA in economics. I was just, I think you might have answered this question in response to Anna, partly to Anna's question, but I was curious how your scholarship has been received by the new historians and how they might be responding to it, or if there seems to be a willingness to like take on the gaps in their own understanding of capitalism.
Okay, it may be a little too early, Gaia, for me to really say with any clarity what the response has been. My book appeared in September, so in terms of the journal literature, it's had one review in social history so far, which was very positive. Overall, my sense is that the younger generation of historians who are coming through the new history of capitalism literature are extremely receptive. I've been getting a lot of very favorable responses at conferences and that sort of thing, particularly from this younger generation. Often people who were in graduate school or entering graduate school around the time of that economic crisis 15 years ago, and are now producing their early work, their early research, and so on. The sort of larger established figures have, to my knowledge, yet to say anything about the book. The people who sort of shaped the field 15 years ago. And it may be some time before they do, or maybe they're going to ignore it. I'm not sure. Uh, the Atlantic history field, particularly people like Marcus Rediker and Peter Linebaugh, have been extremely supportive. I think one of the most important Dutch historians of Dutch slavery, Pepin Brandon in Amsterdam, for example, has been extremely supportive of my work. So it is definitely getting a good response, but so far, kind of the big figures of the new history of capitalism have yet to weigh in on the debate. Uh, I hope they do, but they may just decide they're not going to deal with it.
Yeah. Uh, Camelia? Yes, please.
Sorry, it's me?
Yep.
Yeah,
Loud and clear.
okay.
Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much for the presentation, David. We hope to have the book available in Argentina soon. I'm far away. We are living through a moment in which the debate on modern slavery under the alt-right government it's more relevant than ever. Just yesterday, one could read in a sign carried by the unions opposing the new labor reform here, a banner that read "No to the slave-like or esclavista
Mhm.
labor reform." So I just want to ask how you assess recent studies to classify certain forms of labor as slave labor. What do they argue and which conditions do they attribute to slave labor as opposed to free labor? I am referring to works perhaps by institutions such as the ILO or also as well recent academic studies on contemporary labor conditions and how you approach them and what do you think of these different type of classifications?
Mhm. Yes, and good luck to the movements, Cami, that are fighting on this labor reform right now in Argentina. They have all my solidarity in their struggles. Uh, I should have said because the issue you've raised, I didn't touch on. The new economic historians, when they talk about capitalism and slavery, have tended to emphasize the trade in enslaved people. So they focus on how slave trading was profitable. And Eric Williams has something to that effect also in his book from the 1940s. And while that's true, my concern with them is that enslaved people weren't just commodities being bought and sold, they were also living laborers. And so I want to insist on that role as producers of wealth and therefore the struggles that come with them. After that, on the other issue that you're talking about in terms of both, kind of sociology and historical studies of different kinds of coerced labor, I think that it's useful to make distinctions. And sometimes these typologies can tell us a certain amount between, say, indentured labor and chattel slavery, and so on. But it's very important for me to contextualize always historically. There was a period in, say, the United States or Barbados where indentured laborers and slave laborers were treated very similarly. And then there's a later period of racialization where, in fact, their conditions of life get more and more distinct. And so I think we need to be very attentive to what's the historical context and are there racial formations that are distinguishing these different kinds of coerced labor. Certainly, that's what happens in the United States and the British Caribbean, for instance. They deliberately racialize in such a way that chattel slavery becomes more brutal and more degrading than indentured labor. And indentured labor, of course, eventually really recedes. So, my only caution with all of these discussions is let's not just have typologies. Let's be very careful to historicize them and then to attend to the gendered or racial dynamics that may be differentiating these categories.
Thank
Thank
you very
you.
much. So I have seen there is one question about India and EU. So I would like to go to that question a little bit later, if you all agree. There is one question from Mr. Dr. Madiba, and then we will go to Mitra. So Dr. Madiba wrote a question typed here at the chat. So David, if you could have a look. So I'm curious to know how does or would say slavery and capitalism conceptualize capitalism as a historically constructed system shaped through Africa's incorporation into global political and economic relation, particularly through natural resource extraction and trade arrangement with the global partners.
That's a wonderful question, Dr. Madiba. And let me just say that this book only does so in part in relationship to the European buying and selling of enslaved Africans. I do, in an earlier book, Monsters of the Market, try to address this question that you're talking about here, in part because, as was mentioned, the subtitle of Monsters of the Market is Zombies, Vampires, and Global Capitalism. And 1/3 of the book is addressed to zombie and vampire imagery in sub-Saharan Africa. I focus particularly on Nollywood, on this genre of films from Nigeria. But I talk a little bit about other parts of sub-Saharan Africa. And there I do try to address this question that you're raising, the incorporation into global and political economic relations, which is, as all our theories of colonialism and imperialism instruct us, in an inherently hierarchical incorporation, which, as you say, focuses on natural resource extraction. And essentially here, I do go back to some of the classical theories of imperialism, like Rosa Luxemburg's accumulation of capital, for instance, in this regard. So ironically, I'm actually not pushing my own slavery and capitalism in this regard, but my book, Monsters of the Market, does, I hope, address this a bit for you.
Thank you, David. So, Mitra, could you please ask the question by yourself? Please.
Yes. Hello, everyone. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Thank you, Professor McNally, for your great presentation. I would like to ask one conceptual question. Marx's distinction between formal and real subsumption is often used as a touchstone to distinguish capitalist logic from not capitalist forms of exploitation. Yet, as you mentioned, historically, capitalism has continuously relied on coercion, extra economic violence, and unfree labor. So how should we rethink the analytical usefulness of formal and real subsumption for understanding capitalism today, when coercion and racialized domination remains central rather than residual? And along the same line, I would like to ask if capitalism has always relied on coercion and racialized domination, what does this imply for contemporary socialist strategy? Does it challenge assumptions about gradual reform, democratization, or the role of states? Thank you very much.
Wow, Mitra, we could spend the next hour on these. I mean, to me, these are critical questions, both theoretically, but also, as you were implying at the end, strategically. So let me just try to do a little bit of justice to them. You see, to me, Marx draws this distinction between formal and real subsumption of labor to capital just to help him work through to a degree of clarity. He recognizes that capital doesn't always directly subsume control of the production process. All kinds of putting out work is like this. So take the case in India today of women working in the home, rolling bidis, rolling cigarettes. Okay? And they're doing this essentially on contract with someone who then comes and takes the cigarettes as the finished commodity, the product. But the direct production process, these women working in the home may be doing their work in between looking after children, cooking, going out for an errand, and so on. So capital hasn't seized control of the labor process and labor time and disciplined it directly. It's relying on economic pressures for these people to simply get the product completed. Marx recognizes that that process of subsuming labor to capital is different when capital forces you into its own sites of production, disciplines the process at every stage, and directly supervises it. It's a different social arrangement. And this is important for him in analyzing modalities of exploitation. But we should not try to make more of this distinction than Marx was trying to do in terms of theoretical clarification, because Marx was dedicated at that point to understanding modern factory production. That was the new phenomenon emerging in the world at the time as he's living in Britain, that he knows he needs to understand. But as he begins to broaden his outlook, and the work of Kevin Anderson, beginning with his book Marx at the Margins, has been so important to this, where Kevin Anderson essentially shows us that in the last 15 years or so of his life, Marx was beginning to think much, much more about what the globalization of capitalism means. Because one of his unwritten books for his great project was The World Market, where he had to now move outside of the framework of Britain and of Europe. And he's studying and writing. He spends a lot more time studying the history of India, for example, but he's also reading about Russian history, indigenous societies in the so-called New World, and so on. And he's commenting regularly on peasant-based production that's being subjected to formal subsumption. And as I said earlier, he's trying to think about the plantation system. As he writes about the Civil War in the United States, Marx also attends much more to racism. He had paid attention to racism towards the Irish in England, recognizing Ireland's colonial status. So his own thinking is in progress, it's in development, it's moving, it's deepening. And I think we need very often to recuperate the critical spirit of that work without feeling hamstrung by particular formulations made at particular points in Marx's own research. The spirit of it, as I showed in that passage where he talks about enslaved people as producers of surplus value, was to recognize the core dynamics of the system are then emanating out across the world in radically different social, historical, and economic contexts. And they're being shaped and reshaped by those contexts. That's a very long-winded way of saying that coercion is much more significant to the history of capitalism than you might think simply from reading the first volume of Capital. And that statement, I think, is not foreign to the spirit of Marx's work, but it means we need to do that heavy lifting ourselves, doing the research, so that, for instance, when we see indentured labor on tea plantations in 19th century Assam, for instance, we recognize this as capitalist production, part of the history of capitalism, using coerced bonded labor in tea production on tea plantations, for instance. And secondly, we need to be able to recognize that capitalism is often segmenting the distinction between, quote, fully free laborers and unfree or less free laborers in gender, national, racial, and caste ways. So that, for instance, take Trump's war against migrant laborers in the United States right now. Well, we all know there are more than 10 million undocumented workers in the United States. We all know that. We also know that big business in the United States wants that. The chambers of commerce don't like the crackdown on migrants in the United States. Trump is doing it because a good chunk of his hardcore base needs this racism for him to hold it to his political project. But big business in the United States wants undocumented labor. Why wouldn't you want precarious labor without legal rights that can't vote, can't take you to court, is deeply inhibited about joining or forming unions, and so on? So migrant labor, especially undocumented migrant labor, which is incredibly important in the United States, just to take one case in point, but not only in the United States. The Gulf, for instance, also incredibly important. Racialized, gendered forms of segmentation of the global working class are hugely important to how the capitalist system reproduces itself. And so it follows that any left socialist politics can't just go on about class as if class is not gendered and racialized. My dear friend in Toronto, Himani Banerjee, has written extensively about this. Himani Banerjee argues that capitalism and racism are like milk and coffee. Once they're mixed together, You can't distinguish them. They're one entity, coffee with milk in it. And racialized capitalism or racial capitalism as a formation is like that. And so my own belief, therefore, is that struggles for gender and racial freedom need to be central to the way in which the socialist movement articulates its political project. In countries like India, of course, this means issues around caste have to be very significant and central because there is no genuinely socialist politics which is not universalist. If we are truly about the emancipation of humankind, then we cannot treat these as secondary issues. I'm sorry you got me going there, Mitra, on this point, but I hope that at least helps.
Yeah. I think we could have we could have continued this, but we had to stop at some point. And I'm sure David has some other business to do. And Kosal, is it midnight already for you, Kosal?
Yeah, it closed
Yeah,
midnight
he's
in
based in
Vancouver.
Cambodia. It's midnight for him, so we have to let him go. With that, David, thank you very much for your time. I would like to thank the audience for this wonderful questions and discussions. And I would love to believe that this is the way YSI should be. We should ask questions and learn from each other. And of course, speakers like David, who has done extensive research on important topics that we want to know more about. So thank you, David. Thank you very much once again. Thank you, audience. And with that, we officially conclude the session. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I really enjoyed meeting all of you, and I send you solidarity and all best wishes.
Thank you. Thank you, David.